Before we begin, this video is sponsored by Vezi. If you're someone like me who loves slick, lightweight, comfortable shoes with a strong grip for slippy, uneven conditions, and breathability to prevent you from getting sweaty, smelly feet, then Vezi footwear is for you. Designed with a dual climate knit material called Dymatex, Vezis not only adapt to unpredictable spring weather, but they keep your feet cool in hot temperatures and warm in cold temperatures, with a seamless waterproof coating that, for me, has survived multiple stress tests through many muddy countryside adventures. However, if you're a city or indoorsy person, I recommend Vezi weekend sneakers for their smart casual look in both social and professional settings, and the consistent comfort they provide whilst traveling around the concrete jungle. Simply put, Vezis are my get up and go shoes. I don't have to think about weather, terrain, or general appearance because Vezis are reliable and adaptable to whatever activity I have ahead of me. For example, this month I'm packing for a trip to the Netherlands, and what's great about Vezis is that I literally do not need to pack any other shoes, making them the perfect one and all, and thus giving me extra luggage space to pack other essentials, or in other words, my work laptop. Thanks, Vezi. Simply go to vezi.com/Ryan and use my code to not only help out my channel, but to select from a stylish variety of shoes to suit your personal look and get 15% off your entire order, including free shipping to the following places listed below. This video is intended for those who have seen HBO's The Last of Us, so if you haven't, several points will lack context, so you've been warned.
Lying on the couch, watching Sunday football. That greasy smell of a downtown hot dog. The sound of a plane flying overhead. Just one peaceful night. A clean conscience. All gone.
I can still recite word for word Joel's quietly somber monologue that teased The Last of Us back in December 2011, overlaid with stock imagery of riots, disaster, and civil unrest that, akin to the opening of Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later, gave us a glimpse into a world consumed by chaos, violence, and immorality. A week later, I remember becoming overwhelmingly hyped when Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley revealed Naughty Dog's first M-rated game that ambitiously detoured from their relatively light-hearted Uncharted series. It saw two protagonists called Joel and Ellie surviving a feud with a group of attackers before being chased by a profoundly haunting reimagining of the zombie in the form of the fungus-spewing clicker. Soon after, Ellie was remodeled after likeness comparisons to Elliot Page, while Druckmann and Straley drew our attention to the now infamous clip from BBC's Planet Earth documentary, where David Attenborough narrates about a parasitic fungus known as cordyceps, which infiltrates the mind of its insect host, prompts them to die atop the highest surface, and rains spores down upon its colony to spread the fungus further. The Last of Us pondered the haunting sci-fi question, what if this could happen to humans? However, Druckmann and Straley stressed that the game would de-emphasize the creatures in favour of a predominantly human story that, while not groundbreaking during the peak of zombie fiction, was certainly one to get excited for under the mastery of a team like Naughty Dog. I actually remember immediately buying the book that inspired much of the environmental and level design called The World Without Us by Alan Wiseman, which theorised a scientifically accurate rundown of how nature would reclaim the world if we just suddenly ceased to exist. It was the first time since Alan Wake did I follow a game's development so religiously, and when I finally got my hands on the Joel edition almost 10 years later on launch day, was I worried I had set myself up for disappointment. However, The Last of Us is one of my favourite pieces of fiction. I even made a video shortly after its release that I don't dare look at again because it's almost 10 years old, but I will echo a lot of statements I made in that video because to this day, The Last of Us is responsible for completely reinvigorating my appreciation for storytelling and practically inspired what I do for a career. Hell, I arguably loved the sequel even more despite the hole in my heart that will never heal, so going into the very belated television adaptation, I wasn't at all skeptical despite the so-called video game adaptation curse, given the talent and original creator behind it. Although, coming out of it, if I'm being brutally honest with myself, I really liked it, but I'm irrationally conflicted, and already I can feel my crucifixion being prepped in the comment section below. Being spoiled by such an impactful game, naturally I'm unfairly biased towards it, so my experience won't align with those who are watching it for the first time, but I want to be very clear, I do not dislike the HBO series. It's a great summary of the game, and how it recontextualizes and reinterprets certain details is very welcome, instead of simply retreading the exact same story, even if it does ultimately retread the exact same story. In fact, as we'll see later, there are some changes I think are actually much better, echoing Druckmann's defense that if there's an opportunity to improve, why not take it while leaving in the parts that aren't broken. Yet, that's where my point of contention largely arises. Druckmann and series showrunner Craig Mason, best known for writing the incredible Chernobyl and that weird time capsule of parody movies, seem to bite off more than they can chew by trying to consolidate an entire 14-hour game, where a fair chunk of the storytelling is embedded within the gameplay and design, into 9 unevenly restrictive episodes. As such, we end up with this conflict of new elements that aren't given the time to truly expand on their significance, and old elements being so compressed and diluted that, for me, undermine the absolutely uncompromising emotional disembowelment that the game accentuates. Despite the assurances of HBO, it sort of has what I call the Netflix effect, in that today's binge culture and oversaturated content dumping have created what I think is a vacuum of people demanding instantaneous emotional gratification that evaporates just as quickly as it appears. In other words, for me personally, HBO's The Last of Us is a relatively trivial cutscene-only version of the game, where a lot of the emotion doesn't feel as earned because it lacks the nuances found in the actual gameplay, or in the harshest sense, it's emotion without honest sincerity. As I'll explain throughout, it's not simply because of egregious pacing issues, which to be honest even the game was guilty of as it gets rather choppy post-Pittsburgh, but more so because the writing makes the themes much more forcefully on the nose at the expense of giving Joel and Ellie breathing room to develop their relationship organically. Now, my criticism is obviously countered by the fact that the show clearly works well for so many people, such as my girlfriend who experienced it for the first time with great enthusiasm, which provided a brilliant balance between our perspectives, as I spent most of my time in pointing DiCaprio meme form. The inherent problem with tackling such a hot topic like The Last of Us this soon after the finale, because we need to rake in those sweet views, is that we're all susceptible to recency bias, where say 6 months down the line, once our emotions have settled, we might start to see more rational evaluations, let's say. In fact, by that point, my perspective on the series will likely grow more positive, because for as emotional as I am while writing this, I usually start to feel better about things with distance. I know, the idea of having a change of perspective is shocking in the age of hyperbolic internet discourse. For further transparency, I'm in a really frustrated and overwhelming point in my life at the moment, so I'm running on pure, messy, ranty energy, and I know for a fact if this video was 45 minutes longer or more carefully refined over time, I could much better explain my petty nitpicks, but honestly, in its current state, it is a truthful, raw reflection of where I'm at right now. I mean, I'm only human after all. I only ask that we try and have a nuanced discussion in the comments yeah, I know that's not gonna happen, but I am genuinely curious to hear from those who are experiencing this story for the first time without prior knowledge, because you're inherently going to have a more unique perspective than my nitpicky, pretentious ass who doesn't like it when someone tampers with his precious video game. So the first general conflict I want to talk about is tone, in that while both versions hit all the same narrative beats, the HBO series lacks a greater sense of world building to establish and maintain the bleak, dying, perilous, and unforgivingly cruel setting that the freedom fighter group the Fireflies wish to rectify.
It's a weird fucking tone, man.
That's just the way he sounds. He has an asshole voice. Joe, tell him he's okay.
Everything is great.
Dude.
Outside the father-daughter dynamic that defines the journey, the basic goal is for Joel to escort Ellie through a dangerous wasteland in the hopes of locating the Fireflies who wish to develop a vaccine from Ellie's immunity. In the very simplest terms, it's about Ellie's flickering hope of saving a dying world that, in Joel's eyes, is already too far gone. However, compared to the game, I rarely ever got a sense that this world was anywhere near as dangerous as it likes to tell us it is. For a property famous for its art artistry, the series likes to tell but rarely actually show us anything, diluting the tremendous influence Cormac McCarthy's utterly harrowing The Road and Blood Meridian had on the game. The tone of the game resembles McCarthy's soul-crushingly depressing worlds that, while genreless, blend between themes of survival horror and western as they explore man's barbaric and selfish nature when removed from the values and morals that form culture and society. The Road depicts this through a father and son traveling towards an undetermined place in a world on the brink of extinction, going as far as to show the father teach his own son how to execute himself if alone or worse, surrounded by cannibals, while the father contemplates his own mortality while fragmently remembering his wife prior to her death at the beginning of the apocalypse. Just from that description, I made a video a few years back if you want to see more. I don't need to explain how The Last of Us is ultimately a derivative of the story, but with more emphasis on hope. Yet, more contentiously, the story just as equally takes from Blood Meridian, an anti-western about a boy traveling with a group of vicious scalp hunters who kill more out of habit than purpose. To put it somewhat lightly, Blood Meridian is a gruelingly nightmarish tale of ultimate nihilism, where the point of the book cynically lampoons the trope of man is the real monster by simply saying, man is man. What reason are we put on this earth if not to survive by any means necessary? I'm not going to go any deeper into the novels, otherwise we'll be here for like 6 hours, but you'll see throughout what I mean when I say that McCarthy's grim philosophy is so ingrained in The Last of Us's distinct tone and world building that it feels completely wrong to take it away for the series. Here's what I think is missing. Originally, Chernobyl's director Johan Rink was attached to direct, but dropped out due to scheduling conflicts, only for his replacement to later leave production due to creative differences, causing Mason to step in to direct the rest of the pilot. For as incredible and efficient as Craig Mason's writing was in Chernobyl, Johan Rink's direction along with Hildur Gnathatir's score was just as responsible for what made it so bone-chilling, effectively not far off Druckmann's direction alongside composer Gustavo Santaolalla. Losing that distinct visual eye made the series feel less rich in my eyes. It doesn't have that same gritty cinematic stylization, relegating itself to a television look for as wonderfully impressive as its design was under such constraints. To those who have not played the game, for me what truly sells the relieving moments of beauty and hope is how suffocatingly violent, mean-spirited and depraved much of Joel and Ellie's experiences are. Don't get me wrong, it definitely oversells its gratuity. I mean, it gives the player a fucking flamethrower, but showing us the actual violence was a means of confronting us with how desperate and moralist the world had become. When Ellie begins to see the real world, she's provoked by how shockingly worse humanity is outside the quarantine zone that was already a hotbox of violence and desperation. She grew up with this being the norm, so it speaks volumes when in fact she's not as desensitized to violence as Joel is, despite him coming from a world that once knew how to love.
Let's just be cool, man. Take it easy. Take it easy.
Fuck. Hearing them talk, at least they're scared of us.
Just try not to let your guard down.
I'm just saying, it's good having you on my side. That is a compliment.
Okay.
The Last of Us came out during a period when Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead popularized the whole suddenly killing off a character trope and literally does the same thing to hammer home the point about how unfair and unpredictable death can be. The Walking Dead gets a lot of unfavorable criticisms for being cheap, melodramatic and boring, and yes, it totally was post-season 3, but to their credit, they understood that the sudden horrific violence was less about spectacle and more about reinforcing just how fragile life was in an endlessly dangerous world, thus elevating moments of compassion and tenderness when the rest of the show was utterly bleak. I despise the criticism that violence and gore are cheap and tasteless because good art isn't all about pandering to your feelings. It also seeks to challenge us so we appreciate our comforts and morality even more. I discussed it briefly in my video on New French Extremity. Shock has an intended effect, and with the right balance, investing in what you could call lowbrow stimuli produces higher emotional returns when contrasted with beauty, love, and kindness. Case in point, episode 3, A Long Time. After 2 episodes of misery, Bill and Frank's isolated episode about 20 years of stable love in a decaying world is a masterful juxtaposition that sees the rest of the series go downhill for me, as it feels to ever again rekindle the stark dichotomy between glimmering hope and unrelenting despair. In the game, Bill is a paranoid, antagonistic doomsday prepper who we learn has broken up with his lover Frank because Bill refused to invite new people into their lives, eventually ending with Bill discovering Frank's hanging corpse after Frank was bitten trying to flee town. He and Joel share an interesting dynamic. Bill is repressed, strong-headed, distrusting, and aggressively cynical, calling Joel's objective a pointless crusade that will only get everyone killed. Technically, it's foreshadowing, but the level actually shows a warmer side to Joel, as he kinda resists Bill's nihilism and even comes to respect Ellie's capabilities and self-sufficiency. In the series, Joel actually takes on video game Bill's personality, which I'll come back to later, whereas Nick Offerman's Bill is a gentle giant, thanks to the fact that his love for Frank is kindled until the day they both die. It is a poignant and meaningful detour from the main story because the outcome triggers Joel into fighting for a purpose as Bill did with Frank, in turn reflecting the relationship Joel begins to have with Ellie. Once Frank chooses assisted suicide after becoming terminally ill, Bill chooses to go out with him as he's fulfilled his purpose to keep on living out of love, which is later mirrored when Joel reveals to Ellie he attempted suicide soon after his daughter Sarah died, as he felt no purpose to keep on living. Admittedly, it does oversell the theme, but it's still a gorgeous, bittersweet episode that transcends the grim world around the characters, showing us that love and comfort can be reclaimed when all hope seems lost. Now, we will continue this discussion on the human condition when we get into characters post episode 4, but let's address the elephant in the room, and that is the infected. Look, I get it. The Last of Us is not about the infected. That's literally been the case for all of zombie fiction since the days of George A. Romero and the inspiration he got from post-apocalyptic genre pioneer Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend. However, that doesn't mean the infected don't have a crucial significance to the world and its characters, especially when the infected are directly responsible for the deaths of 5 related characters in the series, let alone is the very danger that encompasses the entire world and caused humanity to resort to the very terrible, desperate behavior we see exhibited throughout the fucking show. One point that the opening of the show makes is that infected and humans share the same common interest, self-preservation, to endure and survive, thus not only calling back to the themes of Blood Meridian, but the very nature of, well, nature itself. What I think the show fundamentally forgets post episode 2 is that it's still a classical story of survival, yet it never looks or feels like this big, near impossible obstacle it tells us it is. This point will expand into the human obstacles, but for the infected, I love how it sets up in episode 2 about the infected being this hive mind horde who can be attracted to a location from just an incidental step on fungus. But for all the tension it creates in the moment, akin to the spores in the game, making it feel like one step could be your last, outside of small, isolated moments like the Kansas City leader ignoring a hive of infected before it's too late, the tension is never persistent, thus I never felt any fear for Joel and Ellie along their journey. There's no fear of unpredictability, no surprise, and while I'm obviously more desensitized than most people given I watch a lot of horror movies, if I was to describe this series' mood in one word, it would be empty. The world just does not feel as bleak or as harsh as the game, and the very selected moments that the show tries to make it seem bleak and harsh are not enough to convince me it's persistent. The series even admits its own lack of danger in a short conversation about the infected basically being non-existent outside cities, which is no different from the game, but even when they arrive in Salt Lake City, we don't even get a final obstacle to fulfill the premise that the infected were really of such dire significance. Of course, the show cannot replicate every encounter from the game because of time constraints, but by the end of the game, I tangibly felt the exhaustion Joel and Ellie got from their survival. It made Salt Lake City a relief, compounded by the giraffe signifying the hopeful light at the end of the tunnel. I know this will come off as ironic to those that like to call me pretentious, but there is this other pretentious sentiment I constantly hear where, oh, you're just impatient because you just want to see action and violence instead of just being appreciative of the human drama. Well, here's the thing. Action is storytelling. Characters just sitting about talking and crying isn't any more meaningful than watching how they respond to the trials and tribulations of the world that's established. It is literally the core foundation of the hero's journey, which has existed since the dawn of storytelling. Moments like the sniper scene really exemplify how unpredictable and dangerous the world should constantly be. The human encounter was so negligible compared to the game, despite calling attention to Joel's ability to be ruthless, as forcefully on the nose as it was, but thankfully the infected make up for it with legitimate stakes. Watching Joel desperately struggle to protect Ellie informs his character through action, as it's the first time we see him genuinely fear for her safety after the intimate bonding moment they shared in the previous episode. That moment felt more natural and real than all these other egotistical writers' moments that forget we're still watching a visual medium. In the game, the scene mirrors an earlier encounter where Joel tries to clear a path while Ellie watches him above with a rifle. Ellie's shown to be very capable at protecting Joel, much to his relief, thus Pittsburgh is the moment where Joel realizes he needs Ellie as much as she needs him. Their need to protect each other encapsulates the theme of characters either working together or dying alone in apocalyptic fiction. It's even a believable way to build into Joel getting too comfortable with the idea of making Ellie his surrogate daughter. This is what I mean when I say action is storytelling. Horror can bring characters together. It might be controversial, and this isn't a criticism towards Neil Druckmann, but the original game probably benefited from having game director Bruce Straley somewhat play devil's advocate to Druckmann's zealous overambition for writing.
A lot of the storytelling happens on the joystick. And once we remove the infected, it's like all of a sudden now we can't tell the story through gameplay of what happened to the world. It lets you see, once you're fighting them, the threat that people had to deal with, that otherwise would just be very cerebral and people could talk about it, but you couldn't necessarily experience it yourself. In a novel that might work, in a game for us, specifically an action game, it didn't work.
The infected serve just as much of a symbolic purpose to the overall world, that nature is unstoppable, uncontrollable, and obviously unpredictable. As Alan Wiseman's book states, you can't stop nature claiming a land that was never ours to begin with. The fungus literally consumes us, and the point episode 2 makes is that it's only a violent entity if you resist. Humans are the worst, sure, but the fungus cares even less, and seeing how widespread the fungus is makes a massive world feel more oppressive because it catches you when your guard is down. For me, the lack of infected wouldn't be a problem if the danger was compensated by the human encounters they constantly talk about but rarely actually show, and when they do so, they're never anywhere near as tangibly threatening as the game. So, like the game, we basically have two dangerous human factions, the Kansas City militia, which is logistically changed from Pittsburgh, and David's group of survivors who have resorted to cannibalism. Bluntly speaking, I dislike the handling of these two encounters because not only are they generally weaker threats than the infected, despite technically being more dangerous, they further dilute the overall lack of danger by trying too hard to humanize characters in a way that adds little to our understanding of the world that we don't already get from other characters. In these two cases, it's a situation of less is more because in the game, you still get the point of these groups without over-contextualizing them. The Kansas City militia are actually not too different from the Washington Liberation Front from Part 2, in that they barbarically overthrew the government with the intent of reforming the aggressive martial law protocol within quarantine zones, but ultimately proved to be no better in their cause. In fact, they're technically worse because they basically enslaved the city under a dictatorship, where the leader Kathleen is fueled by vengeance to go after Henry for ratting out her brother to the former military who then killed him, or something like that. The added detail is compelling and justifies needing 2 episodes to fully flesh it out, but again, that comes at the expense of 1 episode less focusing on Joel and Ellie. I mean, it probably could have been 90 minutes like the Bill and Frank episode, so it's weird they split it into 2 halves. In the game, Pittsburgh is operated by a group called the Hunters, who seek to trap, murder, and pillage unlucky travelers they call tourists. We learn nothing about their individual leadership, but through organic world building, we do learn about their operation through character-driven reactions, and it adds a further conflict to their savagery through small incidental human moments that unmask these villainous enemies as ultimately just real, ordinary people trying to survive like the rest of us. The Hunters are the first true experience of how utterly depraved humanity has become in desperate circumstances, with Joel even revealing he and his brother Tommy used to be on a side with a similar nasty barbaric quality. Pittsburgh in the game is not only crucial to the thesis of Joel's violent character, but more so it's where we see Joel and Ellie connect the most through their efforts to survive. They go through absolute hell in this section, where their constant near-death experiences bring them closer together, with Ellie even learning to numb herself to killing other people, only for it to eventually come back to haunt her when killing David, as it results in trauma and survivor's guilt.
I shot the hell out of that guy, huh?
When the game was revealed to the public, Pittsburgh was the level they placed almost all their emphasis on, as it best encapsulated the type of world they wanted to present, one where violence is a painful, desperate necessity, as both parties were just simply trying to survive. What's incredibly crucial is how it defines the psychology of its characters, whereas the show just sort of replaces all this complexity with grief. The show still has Joel conflictingly acknowledge Ellie saving his life, but they reduce the impact with this insultingly weak version of the gruelingly intimate ambush that sees Ellie hide as Joel executes some kid off screen. I get the effect it's going for is by having us see vague glimpses of Joel's cold, violent nature after Ellie first witnessed it when Joel beats a soldier to death outside the quarantine zone, but as we'll see when I get into Joel's characterization, it just doesn't do enough for me to buy into his brutality. The game even has Ellie make subtle comments about being scared of Joel's violence, but like I said regarding violence helping to accentuate levity, between the horrific encounters in Pittsburgh, we see wonderfully tender moments where Joel teaches Ellie about the world she never saw. We get one optional moment from the Pittsburgh level in episode 3, but I wanted more of that. Sure, the show can't be moment to moment like the game, but the gameplay carries so much of the weight in their relationship outside of cutscenes. This is all shown through the way Ellie gets more involved in combat, to her anxiously sticking close to you in messy firefights, to those cuter moments of Joel showing increasing fatherly warmth. You can't really adapt these moments when you're under the short time constraints placed on the series. By now, I'm sure folks have commented on the fact that it would be unrealistic to show Joel murder dozens of people like in the game, so let's briefly talk about ludonarrative dissonance. So, ludonarrative dissonance is this big fancy word that basically refers to the accepted conflict between gameplay and story, in that there's a necessary suspension of disbelief for the gameplay that detaches itself from the logic of the story. In the case of The Last of Us, it sets up this hyper-believable world, a psychological realism and gritty violence, and then proceeds to have Joel mow down hundreds of people because any other way would not make for an entertaining game. It comes up a lot regarding The Last of Us because Naughty Dog's previous series Uncharted comically always had the escapist trope of a charming, funny hero fucking murdering hundreds of people without ever flinching with PTSD or whatever. It's even more apparent in Uncharted 4 post Last of Us, where they tried to bring that psychology into it, but it made the firefights seem even more increasingly out of place with a story so grounded in realism. Regardless of how nitpicky you are, any reasonable person can disassociate the sensationalist actions of gameplay with the logic and reality quality of the story, whereas with live action, inherently it makes less sense to have Joel pile up the same body count as the game. However, that does not mean he is incapable of the same violence. In fact, a good example of what Bruce Straley described as the balance of power, where tension can still exist even when we know the hero is obviously going to triumph, is Jeremy Saulnier's Green Room, where clueless protagonists still take out a bunch of trained killers, but at the cost of a lot of injuries and psychological damage. I'll get into this later, but all I'm saying for now is diluting the violence at this point in the story for the sake of adding an extra new plotline, I think takes tension away from the conclusion of the main story. The change to Kansas City simply doesn't work for me because Kathleen's entire story ends up being unsubtle foreshadowing for both the ending and the events of Part 2, instead of letting the ending tie directly to Joel's psychology and his relationship with Ellie through the dangers they encounter. Kansas City plays too much into Mason writing with the benefit of hindsight of Part 2, where the outcome of Kathleen's story is that her thirst for vengeance takes down both herself and everyone else around her, showing a domino effect of devastating consequences for one selfish action. The thing is, I would have less of a problem with this overall if it didn't then just go on to regurgitate the exact same thematic narrative with David's group, who are hunting Joel and Ellie out of vengeance for Joel killing one of their group at the university. In the game, David's group more or less serve as a way to give Ellie independent character development, which would be fine in the show had it established enough psychology to her character to inform her survivor's guilt surrounding both Sam and Riley.
I forgot to leave that stupid robot on his grave. What should I do with it?
Ellie.
What? I want to talk about it.
No.
Why not?
How many times do we need to go over this? Things happen, and we move on.
It's just...
That's enough.
You're right. I'm sorry.
The fall and winter chapters are where we experience firsthand how much of Ellie's survival skills are learned from Joel. They arrive at the university where the Fireflies lab is meant to be, only to discover it empty and are quickly attacked by a mysterious group of raiders, who Joel proceeds to kill before he gets wounded himself, leaving Ellie to guide him out safely while skillfully flanking and executing other raiders along the way, almost identical to Joel in previous chapters. When we finally play as Ellie, she's effectively a little Joel, mirrored precisely in the gameplay as she inherits Joel's cold, vicious mean streak, which literally plays into the entire premise of Part 2. We won't get into it because it's a story for another time, but in that game, we see how Ellie's anger and selfishness is a byproduct of Joel's own behaviours and actions, as throughout Part 1, he indirectly instills bad traits in her by teaching her how to be a better survivor, as it were. Ludonarrative Dissonance of course means it wouldn't make sense for Joel and Ellie to rack up the same body count in the university section, and it sure as hell is less believable when she's chased by David's group later on, but in the show they're attacked by like 3 or 4 guys inconsequentially, Joel kills one in self-defense, discovers he's wounded, and that's it? It feels like such a nothing scene and weakens the overall intent of what it's likely going for, which is to subvert these random attackers in the eyes of Joel and Ellie, like Pittsburgh in the game, into real people with real lives by later showing David's community grieving the death. This is exactly what Part 2 does by showing 2 different sides of the conflict, where in binary terms, to Ellie they're bad guys, but to others they're good guys. This is even highlighted when Joel executes the doctor at the end of the series, but we're not going to get into that for obvious reasons. It just forces the theme and spoon feeds it to the audience, along with this love of foreshadowing and overindulging and showing how vengeance is bad and what it means to fight for those you love, etc., instead of just simply keeping with the organic flow of a survival adventure. In this effort to make it seem more deep, they make an already deep story look shallow. They even make David into a preacher who found God in the apocalypse and admits his community is a cult, which is another case of over-delivering on characters who work better with a certain ambiguity. Don't get me wrong, I'm in absolute favour of all the changes and adding more characterization and world building and more story, this, that and the other, but it only has 9 9 fucking episodes to do this! If part 1 was 2 seasons, ending with Sam and Henry's shocking deaths, which serve as a significant turning point for Ellie's survivor's guilt while Joel shows emotional conflict towards her, not only would it give Joel and Ellie their much needed breathing room, but this expanded universe they're trying to build would feel less like a footnote. It undermines its own intent by throwing all these artificial tropes we've seen countless times before to create the simple illusion of emotional complexity. I love the idea of the show being clever enough to make me sympathize with a group as immoral and barbaric as the Hunters, or as manipulative as David. What's there is a strong foundation that collapses because of a flimsy time constraint. In the game, it works well because David is just a stranger who lures Ellie into a false confidence despite her wiseness when first encountered, playing off the uncertainty of humanity's moral standing after seeing both seemingly good and bad people along her journey. Or rather, she starts to learn firsthand neither type of person actually exists, and everyone is motivated by pure self-interest. In the game, there's no doubt he's eventually going to turn into a bad guy, but you're put into Ellie's headspace so well that there's enough doubt in the ambiguity. In the show, he's very outwardly presented as a villain. The game is already tropey by design, sure, but at least the character study within it wasn't as directly archetypical as the show. This chapter is built over roughly 2 hours of gameplay. In the show, it's less than 40 minutes. It is not only incredibly rushed in trying to add new information, but it also doesn't take the time to justify why this new information is necessary. This is probably my most petty criticism, but it kinda plays into the issue of pandering to the game while seemingly missing the point of it. There's a line in the series taken directly from the game where David gives a monologue about everything happening for a reason, and pointing out how Ellie and him crossing paths seemed destined as he was looking for a crazy man traveling with a little girl. 2 things here. Firstly, you could argue the line makes sense because playing into the idea of seeing the conflict from different perspectives, they're only ever going to see Joel murdering one of their own as him being a madman, but secondly, the line makes sense contextually in the game because both Ellie and Joel kill quite a few people from David's group. It's the first time in the game where you see killing leading to retribution. I'm not saying they need a massive body count, but a couple of deaths would justify the line just slightly more, and here's why. Throughout the game, it's subtly sold in the background that Joel could be seen as being on a warpath of sorts, and leaving behind a trail of destruction in his wake that from his, Ellie's and our perspective was just survival and self-defense. Even in Pittsburgh, the Hunters make a point about Joel murdering their entire ambush team, which the show vaguely references but nothing comes of it, terrifying the absolute shit out of them before you, well, fuck them up anyway. The show is inconsistent with what it wants to do with him, but in the game, Joel is actively established as an all-too capable killer, so David's line about a crazy man has profound weight to it in its simplicity because we are truthfully being told by someone on the other side, despite David obviously being a far worse human being, that Joel is a dangerous psychopath leading Ellie astray, which is exactly how Joel, Bill, Tess and so on describe everyone else around them, and it's a line that permeates in the final outcome.
Don't get upset. It's not your fault. I'm just a kid.
For me, Ellie is almost perfect in the series. It's a much more simplified characterization, but it is elevated by Bella Ramsey's delicate and committed performance, with even an uncanniness that's akin to when Shaggy was played by Matthew Lillard in Scooby-Doo. On the other hand, Joel is a much trickier beast in that I appreciate what they're going for, but there is a noticeable indecisiveness between adding new elements and trying to retain old elements. What I think sets the tone for the characters and gameplay is a small interaction with a man who is trapped under debris and infected by spores. It's a small, inconsequential event, and the game doesn't force you to pay attention to him or make any specific choice about his fate, but it does allow you to make a personal, morally conscious decision as to whether to save your bullets and let the guy suffer, or put him out of his misery. It has zero impact on the game, but it does instigate 2 things. Firstly, it puts the player into Joel's shoes in how to operate in this world, i.e. do you keep the resources to yourself and coldly ignore a man who's already dead, or do you sacrifice resources to hold onto some fragment of compassion and humanity? And secondly, it implies the trolley problem of Joel's character, in that either action or inaction still has a negative effect on someone. Game Joel is a walking lump of muscle, a subordinate to Tess, serving as a ruthless enforcer who is apathetic to death and violence after years of survival. He's actually pretty content in the game. He doesn't linger on his pain, if anything, he's actually moved past it, and it isn't until Ellie arrives do we see that pain begin to re-manifest. We see his unmatched capabilities to hunt, scout, lead under fire, and you buy into his intelligence and strength to outman certain groups. In the series, like I said earlier, he's more of a combination of Bill and Part 2 Joel. He's clearly a sensitive man who is swallowing his emotions and hiding behind a persona, and when he confides in Tommy about his fears of growing weak and incapable as he gets older, we see a man who just wants to live in peace and solitude. I enjoyed Pedro Pascal's Joel because he's fallible and on the verge of giving up. He's deaf in one ear, doesn't have the strength or agility of a former footballer like Game Joel, is an inconsistent shot after 20 years of physical and mental deterioration, but despite the adjustments to his characterization, they don't ever fully commit to the change and end up lapsing back and forth between two very different interpretations. Part 2 Joel is a vulnerable, quieter character because he's on the verge of turning 60 and has now settled down and learned how to love again, but Troy Baker's Part 1 Joel is meant to be terrifying because of his kill now, talk later philosophy. As I said regarding Pittsburgh, he was once as depraved as the people he kills, which is conveyed gruesomely in his interrogation of David's men when searching for Ellie. It doesn't feel as in character in the show because our understanding of Joel's violence is incredibly basic, despite how often it likes to tell us he was once violent, ironically making some of the more barbaric moments seem oddly out of place. Where his violence works best in the show is in two reflective scenes, one where he kills his neighbor when rescuing Sarah, which puts emphasis on her reaction, and the second being the PTSD trigger beatdown of the soldier, which puts emphasis on Ellie's reaction. In theory, that's all you really need to know about the brutality of his character, because subsequently the journey reveals his age to be a significant factor as to why he no longer fights the way that he used to. The moment where he practically begs the sniper to drop his gun and walk away is a great example of showing the softened nature of his character. He doesn't want to kill anymore, but knows that he has to if the gun is turned on him. Yet, I think I would buy his mercy even more if he did not just go all merciless on the kid during the ambush scene the day before. That would have been the perfect time to subvert his character by showing compassion and letting the kid live, only for it to bite him in the ass if the kid ratted him out to Kathleen. Sure, he kills him out of retaliation, but my ultimate problem with this is that by not deciding what direction to take Joel's character, it hurts the lead-in to his provocative final actions. In the game, you sympathize with Joel because you're experiencing the world predominantly through his shoes, blinding you and desensitizing you to the fact that he's always been a violent psychopath who brings Ellie down with him, as Part 2 elaborates on. In the words of Tess, people seem to forget that all these characters are shitty people motivated by pure self-interest. Understandably so, because they're in a desperate, cruel world that wants them dead. Seeing and experiencing Joel's monstrous actions throughout the game is the biggest moral debate. The brilliance of the ending is that you could argue his character comes to love again, but in actuality, he's still the same selfish, violent man from the start who doesn't save Ellie so much as he does saves himself. Unlike Joel, Ellie ends Part 1 in a bad place. She's plagued with distrust and survivor's guilt from all that she's experienced. She's cynical about a world that once excited her, and that manifests into Part 2, where we see that very same domino effect of disaster shown through other characters throughout the series.
I struggled for a long time with surviving. And no matter what, you keep finding something to fight for.
A lot of Ellie's reasoning for what she does in part 2 comes down to the fact that her moral compass is redefined and skewed by a man who no longer has one, and so her eventual selfishness, as I said earlier, is a result of Joel's actions throughout the first game. The fundamental question stories like this always ask is what lengths are people willing to go to survive, whether it be spiritually, morally, emotionally, or even just literally. The lack of depth given to their complicated relationship weakens Joel's actions. However, the actual execution of Joel's rampage through the hospital when suddenly Ludonarrative Dissonance doesn't apply so Joel can rack up that body count is still very effective in a different way. In the game, Joel, saving Ellie has a dreamlike quality to it that parallels the opening sequence with Sarah. Joel tightly grips Ellie in his arms as he desperately tries to escape, with disembodied flashlights chasing behind, echoing the same moment Joel grips Sarah as they're pursued by infected, only to encounter a visually identical soldier with a flashlight on his gun, who then proceeds to shoot Sarah. It's basically Joel's PTSD triggering a psychotic breakdown, like when in the show, a soldier triggers memories of Sarah. Reality is out the window. He's the unstoppable force of nature we see throughout, now consumed by rage and delusion. If the show had better handling of his mercy and compassion, hesitating more and then shocking us with the build-up to him digging back into his John Wick murder vibes to save Ellie from David, I think the effect would be better. It would even make his rampage more shocking because at first he's using his violence to save Ellie, whereas here saving Ellie is purely for himself. In the game, this all comes after taking back his photo of Sarah and being reminded of the world he forgot, with the ending seeing Joel comfort Ellie about finding something to fight for, while subtly gripping the symbolic broken watch given to him by Sarah on his 36th birthday. The very night she died and his world, the only world that truly mattered, was torn apart. Like with Kathleen and David, Joel's actions are somewhat out of vengeance for the world taking Sarah away from him, and as a father wanting to protect his child, this was his second chance. I love the rampage scene in the show because it outwardly shows the violence to hammer up the brutality that was withheld throughout the series, but what intensifies the horror of the scene is his slow, sinister movement when picking up a new gun and refusing to show any mercy to anyone in his way. Again, if mercy was a more prominent theme throughout the show, this would have even more effect. In both versions, he's willing to let the world keep on burning as long as he gets his back. This is not about Ellie, this is solely about him. I love Craig Mason's closing line on Inside the Episode where he says, "Time doesn't really heal anything, it just makes it fade. People heal things." It's a perfect encapsulation of how The Last of Us deals with grief, trauma, and despair. Joel's broken watch is a perfect symbol of these words. It's about the purpose of why we do things, our emotions, our self, our ego. The conclusion of part 2, again no spoilers, doubles down on this very notion. Humans have a choice in how they behave. We can be influenced by our feelings, but ultimately our actions are our responsibility, and it's solely up to us whether or not we accept the consequences, as the characters we encounter are all faced with. But in Joel's case, when telling the truth, he accepts everything, and echoing some of the final lines in part 2, if he was given a second chance in that moment, he would do it all over again.